Hi, my name is Nicole Montojo. I'm a researcher at UC Berkeley working with the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And we've recently done quite a bit of research on rent control, so I will try my best to answer all your questions. And I have a lot of papers in front of me because there are a lot of numbers. I'm going to try to be objective and use numbers. And I need to. So I think one of the issues with how we're thinking about the costs associated with rent control is that it's really narrow when we're talking about the economic costs, and really what we need to consider is the broader costs that displacement has, and that's something that's not reflected in a lot of the analyses. So if we're talking about what the LAO suggested, that it could cost tens of millions, or it could cost much less than that, we also have to think about the costs that already exist to the budget. So by that I mean the $5 billion that the state spends each year on homelessness. If we didn't have to spend that, if homelessness were reduced, then that's a cost that we need to consider. And the cost to the economy when we're talking about, there was a study done by the McKinsey Institute that pointed out that was 140, I want to say billion, but I need to check if it was million. It's billion dollars that was, and we also have to think about who specifically is unable to afford housing, given that when you think about it like that, it's clear how widespread it is and how much the costs to individuals add up. So in our research, we found that 73% of jobs in California don't pay enough to afford rent. 54% of renters are housing cost burdened. And all of that adds to the costs that impact our public budgets, our economy, the environment, and all of those have an unquantifiable cost that isn't often talked about when we're talking about rent control. And that's something that should be considered. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is why new construction is not enough on its own. And I think what a lot of Christina said in the other panel actually is factually correct. And I would say, I don't know if I should say that exactly, but I also agree that we cannot just do rent control, and rent control provides an anchor for other solutions that need to happen over the longer term. Because if we don't have rent control, then people are being displaced now. And if we're working toward greater affordability in the long term, building housing, which takes 30 years, if we ever get to the targets that we need, it'll be too late at that point. And there are a lot of constraints that are affecting the ability of California to meet its construction targets, and rent control is not what is really driving the limitations to construction. It's really land use regulations, and it's also the construction industry, just the shortage of construction workers. So we're not, even if we're trying to build, it's not going to happen fast enough. And one of the statistics that I really wanted to point out was UCLA Anderson forecasts shows that to achieve a modest 10% reduction in price, California would need to increase its housing stock by 20%. That's about 2.8 million additional units of housing. And that's not happening anytime soon. So rent control puts a pause on where rents are at now, which means it's not decreasing rent. That means people are not going to lose money right now because it puts it at where it's at. And then over time, we can create greater affordability by increasing supply, which simply just takes too long. And if San Francisco had much less stringent land use regulations, they still wouldn't be able to build enough. So those are all considerations that I think are important to have as part of the discussion and stuff that wasn't necessarily as fully in the previous kids. I don't know what else I can say in 19 seconds. I guess I should say with homelessness, eviction is a leading cause of homelessness. And if we're trying to keep people from being evicted and being displaced, really high rents are the driver of that. So we need to keep rent from drastically increasing over time.
Robert Weiser.
Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I am a professor of public policy, particularly interested in land development and housing affordability and such, property taxation. So that really is where my expertise is coming from. A disclaimer, I am an economist, right? So I do take that perspective, but I also teach in a public policy program, where we talk about, markets and efficiency and capitalism and all the good things that come from it, but also very concerned about social justice and equity, right? So I can see I'm kind of torn in regard to thinking about rent control and getting involved, with rents and thinking about it. So I'll try to give you both of those perspectives. But I unabashedly will say I'm a capitalist. I believe in the free market system, but I believe the free market system fails many times. And there may be a role for regulation and government to step in and do something. And that's what we're talking about, in regard to rent control, being a landlord and a renter, right? And telling, that constraining it in some way, saying how much you can raise the rent. I'm sure you've had some background on it, but we have to be very clear that, we already have an allowance for rent control in California, right? Local jurisdictions can adopt rent control. It can only be vacancy rent control. That means when, your rent is protected, it can rise usually at the inflation rate. But when you leave the apartment, then the next tenant that comes in, the landlord has the ability to raise the rent to the market rate, the charge rate. And it can only be for pre-96 properties, right? That basically is what the Costa-Hawkins legislation says. So this proposition is repealing that Costa-Hawkins, right? And allowing for the possibility of rent control of any type, be it vacancy rent control or the possibility of a local community adopting rent control that says, rents now are $1,000 a month, and for perpetuity, that it can only rise by whatever the rate of inflation is. Right? You may have about that. I've heard some of the discussion about the fair return and all that, but that's a pretty extreme situation. That if you're a property owner and you own this piece of property, that you're only ever going to get a return that's equal to the inflation rate, so that's a major change in regard to it. And then it would be applied to all properties, right? And this is the concern in land development in a capitalist system where we have developers who build property and a city adopts rent control. And it's kind of a discouragement. Why do I want to build a new property there where I can go someplace else? And we have to understand, these apartment rentals, especially affordable properties, it's a national market, right? These are developers who can build in Arizona, Nevada, Texas, other places, right? And they see this rent control, and it's a discouragement for them coming to a specific locality. And you also have these concerns that, it's not rent control across the entire state, right? It's only going to be probably central cities. I've been advising Mayor Steinberg here in the Capitol dealing with rent control. There was an initiative just described, but now was just up to recently trying to reach a compromise where maybe we could put rent control in for a couple years. While that's in place, try to build more, right? Which is really the ultimate solution. That actually was not, city council could not reach an agreement on that. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues, but I just want you to keep in mind, that we do live in a capitalist system and prices do serve a purpose, right? I mean, when the price is high, it represents that it's a scarce good that a lot of people want, and it serves to allocate that good. And when the price is low, it's the opposite, right? That it's encouragement for more people to buy it. You kind of break that, right? And you put this artificial impediment in of rent control. Now, most economists talk about, we're not. I'm unconcerned with the social welfare and the social justice of people. But as was already mentioned, I've heard, it's all about trying to build more properties, right? And trying to ground the restrictions that California has put in place. There's a lot of NIMBYism in California, housing development. And all of us think, oh, affordable housing, that's great. Let's build some more for California. Oh, we're going to propose when it comes out and your self-interest comes out. And we had this thing called the housing element law in California, right? That every city in a metropolitan area has to take its fair share of affordable housing, right? And, that is actually, state law, right? And the governor and the attorney general and the legislature could actually enforce that, but they run into the politics of the NIMBYism come out when they try to put affordable housing in. I mean, in my mind, those are better ways to go. If we're going to think about rent control, maybe a short-term solution, but to allow every jurisdiction to impose their own types of rent control and lose and go to continuing control, not just vacancy rent control, I think it's too high cost. Just
Thank you. So now we are ready to start asking our questions. If you can turn your tents off to the side, and Damon will start putting names. And then Michael C., and then Steve. Okay, we can start there. So Shirley, microphone, and could you ask your question, please? One way over here.
Right here.
I'll bring it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Could you expound a bit more on the unquantifiable costs that you spoke of earlier?
Okay, and we'll start here. Since we started with you, we'll start here, and then we'll go over, and it's 2 minutes each.
unquantifiable costs in regard to putting rent control in place? I think the issue is that, rent control probably will slow down the building of new homes, right? And then, it reduces the supply, and then, it benefits the people who actually stay in their apartment, right? They get that fixed rent, but when they actually move, when there's a lower supply of apartments in the entire city or in the metropolitan area, then they're going to have to pay a higher rent. So those are kind of unquantifiable costs. There was a recent study, you may have come across it, that some Stanford economists did about rent control in San Francisco that showed, that the Mission area is more gentrified. Rents are higher in San Francisco because of the rent control that they put in place. So, I mean, they're unquantifiable unless you do some statistical analysis to actually come out with them. But those are kind of the long-term costs. The benefits of rent control, as it current stands, goes to people who stay in their apartment, right? You get this fixed rent. But once you move, then you may actually be facing higher costs. And the statistics are out there. The people who really benefit from rent control, the people who stay in their apartments, are older people, right? And they're more affluent people. And even under this current Costa-Hawkins type of law, we have these rent controlled apartments that are only going to go up by the amount of inflation, right? So they go to the landlord, and when it becomes available, they bid a higher price for the rent, and it takes the poor people out of that market, right? So we're trying to help poor people by having a rent controlled apartment. You help them when they're in the apartment and they stay there, right? But in some sense, we don't want poor people to be staying. We want them to be moving to opportunity, right, and be stuck in an apartment. So that's one of the unqualified costs, is it discourages mobility. It just encourages people to stay in apartments.
This study did find that benefits were accrued to renters and that they were substantial. And I think it's important gentrification in San Francisco. That finding about people being able to stay directly contradicts that. They found that they were 20% more likely to stay. And if they didn't have those benefits, many of them would have left the city. And so I think it's a question of, what is this policy trying to do? And it's trying to stabilize renters in place. The question about how do we, cities like San Francisco and LA with rent control have built at greater rates than their non-rent controlled cities in the surrounding areas. So a lot of the economics literature that is out there is more focused on the strong rent control policies, which are not reflective of what modern rent. So I think it's really challenging when looking at the economics analysis. And so when I'm talking about the broader impacts, I'm really talking about how all of the costs of displacement add up when it comes to the impact on the broader society. if people are affected with their mental health and their physical health, what does that mean for our public healthcare systems? What does that mean for our social services systems? And those costs are also impacting all of us as taxpayers, and the ability and strength of our public systems to be able to provide for all of the needs of its residents is harmed.
It'll be, wait, if you're a person, that person will go first, but if not, we're flip-flopping. So Michael C.
Thank you. I have a question because I'm on a quest to make a determination with regard to fair rate of return. But I also have another question. It'll only take 5 seconds to answer, so I'm going to try to tack that on the end because I don't want maybe spending a minute and a half on that question. So I understand that the state of California, I believe it's the state of California, has established a fair rate of return for landlords. I'm just trying to get some sense of what that is, a percentage or a dollar value, and how it's calculated when, and I assume that it comes into place when there's a controversy. And then the 5-second question is just that one of the panelists earlier stated that 97% of rental units are owned by small-time landlords. And I just want to know if either of you know that statistic. I'd be interested in having that confirmed.
So I go first. So that statistic, about 97% of all rental units in California are owned by institutional investors. And then to go back to your question about fair rate of return, so a statute in place through the Constitution and has been further refined in what that means through several court decisions. So it's not a direct formula. It's not like $1,000 is a fair rate of return. But what has been done in cities is that that's determined as part of their rent control ordinance or by the rent board, and when they're refining the details of how rent control is implemented. And it's often the net operating expenses, which includes all net operating expenses, utilities, taxes, and cash flow, and the inflation adjustment. So often it's a percentage of the consumer price index. And so that is an objective way of determining the fair rate of return. And because it's based on net operating income, and that will vary from unit to unit, that means it's responsive to what that unit's rate of return should be. And at the same time, I think there's been a lot of talk about how that's regulated, and all of it still has to hold up in court. So that's the check and balance that is there for the fair rate of return. Let me see if there's any petition for increases. So I think that gives you a sense that landlords are feeling like they are getting a fair return.
Robert?
Yeah, the 97%, I don't know where that came from. I don't know the exact statistic, but that sounds more reasonable, about half and half, ballpark it. Fair rate of return, yeah, that's a very interesting concept. And it's something that you have to go to when you intercede with a market, right? I mean, you know, what is something worth, right? It's what's worth someone's willing to pay for it, and such that's a free market. So if we're going to impinge upon the markets, we have to decide upon this fair rate of return. As was said, it really gets into these rental boards that need to be established, right? Because you know, a landlord will be able to raise the rent more than what's allowed under rent control, providing that they can justify that they've invested in the property, and then that's the fair rate of return that they can have. So this, I was just looking at, this is the initiative that was put forward in Sacramento. After the rent control board makes a decision, then it can go into the court of law, and be decided upon. So, we talked about the some of the unaccounted for costs of rent control. It's a make work for lawyers too, right? And mediators and such. And then it's all good at these local levels. It's not going to be statewide. You're just giving the cities the right to set up the rent control ordinances and these boards. And the whole reason that we need these boards is because now there's an incentive for a landlord to get you out, right? Especially if we don't go. And I don't think most cities are going to go to pure rent control, strict rent control, that the rent's going to be frozen once the property's built. They're going to go to vacancy rent control. That's where it's only been like New York City during World War II when we had strict rent control, when it was frozen constantly. So we're going to go to that. And then so the landlord wants to get you out, right? So they can raise the rent. And then you have to go to this appeals board. Right? Whole other thing about how they can get you out under the Constitution.
The next chance. Okay, so next is Steve. Steve's up with a question.
Assuming Proposition 10 goes into effect, it promises immediate relief while other elements would go into effect that would create more building going on at the same time. But when it says immediate relief, what does that mean? Does that mean each city that wants to put in rent control has to implement it at that level, and is that really immediate? I mean, it seems like it's going to take a long time for a lot of these things to go into effect.
Robert, I think you go first, but if you want to.
I would just say the answer is yes, right? I mean, all that the repealing of the Costa-Hawkins says is that now localities can put into you put these rent control ordinances in place, and they're not going to be applied to pre-96 properties, and they can be, they don't have to be vacancy process with the city council, mayor approval, voting, however they would have to go. Because I just talk about the deal here, right? It's going to take some time. It's not going to be in Santa Monica. They already have plans to apply it immediately to all post-96 properties, right? You can maybe talk about whether they have the plans to go to strict rent control or maintain it at vacancy rent control. But the places that already have it, they can jump much quicker into this broader form of rent control where it applies to all properties as opposed to the pre-96. I'll cede the rest of my time.
So Nicole.
So on the question of what would happen immediately, so it wouldn't be instantaneous. Exactly what you said. It would require that cities pass the ordinance, that they figure out what the implementation looks like, get the rent board in place. But what it really is that it's far more immediate than building. It's far more immediate than us trying to figure out another solution, especially given the way that our regulatory systems work on development. So in that sense, it is the fastest thing that we have. And what was it that I was going to say? And then in terms of the cost, it's a minimal cost when you think, again, relative to everything else. The costs of the fees, say in Berkeley, are around, I think, $250 annually. And there's a portion of that can be passed on to tenants. And then in other places, it's even lower. So really, when you're thinking about the scale of the issue and what that cost is relative to one individual, and then also to the broader state budget, when we're talking about tens of millions more units, that's like 962 million. I had to calculate it, which is just enormous compared to tens of millions, right? So in terms of thinking about what's cost effective, what's the quickest, and what's the most widespread solution that can address the crisis, given how broad it is, rent control is what can do that. Because building cannot do that.
Thank you. Laura, your question.
So this one is more directed at Nicole, because you mentioned right before your time ran out that eviction is the leading cause of homelessness. So I wondered, in communities where rent control has already been established, is there less homelessness? Do you differentiate between long-term and short-term homelessness within that statement? Is there a percentage, and is it mostly focused on California, or is it a nationwide? I know that's a lot. I have a lot of here. Is it directly correlated to homelessness in California, or is that based on a nationwide study? Could we possibly get the citation for that study, just out of curiosity, for that statement?
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat all of the questions? I'm going to write them down and try to answer all
Okay.
of them.
Is homelessness decreased in areas that already have rent control established? With that statement, do you differentiate between short-term and long-term homelessness? Like with rent control in place, are they able to reestablish those families more quickly because of rent control? Is there immediate relief? And that's an add-on that I didn't get to when I was asking originally. Is there immediate relief for homelessness caused by eviction within the projected effects of Prop 10?
Metro areas, and LA was where they found a really strong correlation. But where did I put the statistic? I will try to find it, and maybe I can add that on a little. Oh, here we go. With a 4.2% increase in Los Angeles rents. Oh, sorry, no, that's not it. It is a 5% increase in rent would lead to roughly 2,000 additional people experiencing homelessness. And it's hard to differentiate between, is that chronic homelessness, like over a long period of time, or more of an incidence? But what we do know is that there's 134,000 Californians who are homeless at any given time in California, and that number has grown as rents have increased. Especially in the last year, it's increased by 16,000. So I think if you look at Berkeley and San Francisco, it hasn't decreased there. But I think what the issue is that often rent control is blamed for issues that are not related, or that you can't say rent control caused homelessness to increase, because the incidence of homelessness in San Francisco, I think, has more to do with policing. It has to do with where services are available. Those things are separate, and the response to homelessness is also separate from what rent control does. We need emergency assistance, and then in terms of preventing evictions, rent control is shown to be best implemented when it's alongside a just cause for eviction ordinance. And I'm going to run out of time, but I could say more about what that is later.
Did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I would just caution you. Statistician there. That's why the Stanford study is done by these very well-known statisticians, economists, looking controlling for a bunch of other factors. Right? It's hard to really tease out. Of course, there's been more building in San Francisco and Los Angeles over time, even if they have rent control, because there's so many other factors. The tech boom going on that's caused this building. The question is, would there even have been more if we didn't have rent control? And that's what they did a very good job at coming about. So, it was interesting to say a correlation about homelessness, that, well, we can't say that homelessness is related to rent control because there's other factors going on. But then I heard the argument that, there's a bunch of houses still being built in places, so it's not a fair argument. You're using one, you're not controlling for the other one, right? So it's very difficult to tease that out, and you can't just look at correlations. So I would point that out. And another thing to think about is California is not an island. California does not have a wall around it, to use an improper metaphor that's been used, right? If places come to California, people will come to Los Angeles, right? It might actually even generate more homelessness, right? For people to come here and such. So, because the concern that we have is that the building will stop once you put rent control in place, right? You can imagine, just as an investor, right, that Berkeley puts rent control in place and the surrounding communities do not, and you're going to build a new apartment complex, and now the apartment complex is going to be under rent control the minute you build it, but the community on the other side of the city line does not have it. You're going to build it over there. That's one of the reasons that Costa-Hawkins was really put in place. It's in the state interest, not for all the cities to be constricting their housing supply, because we want to grow as a state, as an economy, and that's what Costa-Hawkins was put in place. We're seeing a bunch of these local rent control ordinances coming up and being nice.
Question, I believe.
Okay, and this is in response to one of the gentlemen that was in the last panel and made the statement that veterans, seniors, and labor unions are opposed to Prop 10, and yet I would assume that, you know, the seniors and veterans would be a population be more interested in rent protections. So on that, why that would be? Why would they be opposed to rent control?
Well, I know the Democratic Party, was in favor of repealing Costa-Hawkins. So, I mean, labor is probably not in general because they're worried about the constriction on the building. You can go to Ballpedia, you can look at the pros and cons of who's supporting it. So I don't know what specific veteran group or senior group actually said that, but rent control does tend to benefit seniors disproportionately. The analogy that's always given is rent control apartments in Silicon Valley or in Santa Clara or San Francisco. Even some of the shows that have been done on it, you always see an older person living there, right? And then and they're so grateful that they've been able to live here for 30 years under this rent-controlled apartment that would cost $3,000, but they pay $750 for it, right? So I mean, that's some of the misallocation that occurs under rent control, right? There's really no. That's just lower income people, younger people are more mobile. And it's great rent frozen, but once they move, there's evidence that rents will actually be higher to them. And I go back to the study that was cited. The cost of rent control in San Francisco since the mid '90s has been annually $5 billion. The savings have been $423 million in rents. Statement was made that, yeah, people are saving rents because of rent control, but when you do the statistical analysis of what was actually lost, it was this, the rent increases were of the $5 billion type of mark. Because there's not as much development going on there, and because it's the more higher income people that can go to those Costa-Hawkins protected apartments and bid the rents up. And then the lower income people, once they leave, do not get to come back to them.
Nicole.
So I want to go back to that study because it gets talked about a lot. The problem with how that study looked at it is that it only looked at renters who were in place in 1994. And so when it says that the costs balanced out in that certain way, it wasn't accounting for all of the benefits that were on top of the set of renters that they studied. So actually the benefits to renters did outweigh the costs. And they sort of talked about that, but really didn't an unfair on their part to do that. And then I also want to point out that seniors have a disproportionate need in terms of their rent burden. There was a UCLA study that just came out that looked at that, and it pointed out that 3/4 of seniors in California are paying more than half of their income, half or more on their rent. So I think it is important to consider who needs rent control, but then also the issue about the issue about it not being applied specifically to low income people is actually an important part of rent control, because if there was a means testing is kind of the term that's used, it would lead to more discrimination against low income renters, because a landlord wouldn't want to rent to low income renters. So it necessarily needs to apply broadly. And I want to also point out, because this came up earlier, that building in Berkeley, for example, which had rent control before Costa-Hawkins, actually increased at its highest level since 1971 in 1989, which is
Rose F.
Let's see, Nicole, you had mentioned in answer to Michael C. that in current rent-controlled areas, you've disputing issues of rent control. Is that simply because, or could it be because of who has to pay for that litigation? Is it the renter that has to pay for it, or is it the owner's responsibility?
So I should clarify, I didn't mean to say that there's less litigation. It's that there aren't many petitions that go to rent boards to need a higher rate of return than what they could already have under the rent control policy in place. And I think when it comes to litigation, to answer your question, San Francisco passed a new law that would provide a lawyer for any tenant who has to deal with rent control disputes. So there is that. But then in terms of litigation, it actually shows that it's somewhat controlled. It's not, I think it was a bit alarmist for the other panelists to say that the cost would be enormous in terms of what litigation could lead to, because a lot of it has already been litigated in court.
All of these rent control, getting back to the fair rate of return, they allow the landlord to fix up their apartment, right? And then justify that as a pass rate of return. So we haven't even talked about the idea of gentrification, and how possibly rent control can cause that. Because you can, if you want to raise your rents, you can justify it by fixing up your apartment, and then you can actually even justify the fair rate of return by the interest that you have to pay, on the loan that you've taken to take it out. So there's that push, to move it up to that level, and to again discriminate against lower income people. So that's something to concern about. And then we have something called the Ellis Act in California, that if you want to get out of the apartment business, right, and you truly are getting out of it, and you're demolishing your building, right, you have the ability to do that. Right. It's a little bit more difficult if you currently have rent controlled people in there. But I don't know if you've talked about this. You have to pay for their moving costs and stuff like that. So that that would be something that would probably also happen more if you had broader rent control, more of these Ellis Act type of petitions, turn it into condominiums, turn it into something a higher end apartment complex in the same way. So that's a concern when you constrain the market and tell a landlord how much they can actually get in return. Stop there.
Vic is the next question, and Pat and Laura, are you in the queue, or was that already answered, Pat? Okay. So if anybody wants to go, if you could turn them up.
Good afternoon. I think, I don't know, but under California Constitution, it says that the fair rate of return, you're guaranteed a fair rate of return if you're the owner or the landlord. But who determines that rate of return? Does it the local rental boards, or is it the state government that will determine that rate? And my other question, can you guys elaborate a little bit more on the difference between full rent control and vacancy rent control? Thank you.
I guess I can start. Yeah, and it's the local board that would establish a fair rate of return, right? And it would have to be specified in the legislation that would put it in place, right? In this piece of paper here that I have like 20 or 30 pages, there's about 3 or 4 pages specifying what a fair rate of return is. I think we've already talked about that. It is, the rents are frozen at the rate that when it goes into place, and then they're allowed to increase at consumer rate or something at that. And then if you fix it up, you're able to raise the rent in some way to cover that. That's a fair rate of return. And then, once it's actually vacancy rent control, we can get to that, right? That means that vacancy rent control is what is only allowed under Costa-Hawkins right now, right? And that means rents are only frozen for the person as long as they live there, right? Once their lease runs out, once they're evicted for just cause, that's the issue why we have to have just cause, because the incentive is to evict people, then it can be raised to the market rate of return, whatever the market will bear, right? The proposition would eliminate that, right? I honestly don't think most people have said that we're going to actually go to this strict rent control, where, like I said, you build your building, you set a rent, and it's only ever going to increase for perpetuity by that amount. That's scary in much more ways than the vacancy rent control. But the vacancy rent control has these incentives then to evict people, right, and be able to raise the rent. Where, if you had strict rent control, you wouldn't have that incentive to evict somebody, because you're just going to get the same exact rent, right? The rents are frozen exactly at that amount. Did you have another question that I missed?
And Nicole, if you want to respond to that question.
To expand upon that, there have been some ordinances, like Richmond, for example, where there was room within the ordinance for the rent board to decide the details. So I figured I could say a little bit in this time answering some of the questions you had about rent boards. So I want to challenge the idea that rent boards are not accountable to anyone, because that's not true. In fact, most rent boards are elected by the electorate. They're either elected or they're appointed by the city council or the mayor. They're elected in Berkeley, they're appointed in Richmond, for example. And so who's on rent boards? It's folks, citizens of the community that decide that they want to run or that are appointed. So the electorate who puts them in. And at the same time, again, the rent board's decisions, if something happens where someone decides that that was unfair, then it's still up, it would then go to the courts, or in some cases it would go to the city council first and then to the courts. So it's not that there are no checks and balances in place for rent boards. I think that's actually really untrue. So when the decisions about how rent control is implemented or how the program is implemented, a lot of that is determined by the rent board and decided by the rent board if the rules are being followed, and then that has been a fair process. I think you can objectively say in a lot of the cities that have it.
Michael, see, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet before we start going to the next one? So we'll go to Shalon first and then Michael C.
My question is, what happens if Costa-Hawkins is appealed? Are the landlords or the people renting out the locations, are they able to immediately increase the rent to the market rate, or is there some sort of stay as to where there would be a pause period where they couldn't make any changes until maybe a new solution was placed that would address the rent control?
Not sure I understand you. So you're asking if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, would people be able to increase the rent?
Right. Would they immediately be able to increase the rent, or would there be some sort of stay until a permanent fix or a new solution is created that will address what was previously done in those individual cities? Or do the individual cities that have rent control, does that remain even if this is removed?
So if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, it won't create rent control. It would allow cities to decide and create their own law, and that won't happen instantaneously. I think we talked about that earlier, that it would take a little while for that to happen, and sometimes cities are not the fastest about that. So it wouldn't allow landlords to immediately increase rents. Rent control that is in place would still exist, and it would allow other jurisdictions to consider the other options of how rent control is implemented that are currently not allowed under Costa-Hawkins. Question?
So in reality, if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, those cities that have rent control will still have rent control, because currently what they have in effect would remain no matter whether Costa-Hawkins passes or not.
Yeah, because they're already in compliance with Costa-Hawkins because they have to be. There are cities that are considering ballot measures where, in Berkeley, for example, if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, they're also considering at the same time on the November election, can we put in a rolling timeline for new construction that would be at 20 years, so that after a building is 20 years old, it would apply. So that'll happen in tandem. And I think there are a couple other cities that are considering things like that, but no one's considering anything as extreme as a rent freeze or anything, considered what strong rent control that was more back in like the post-World War II era.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of my facts, but I thought actually on this that there are some cities that, if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, they will immediately go to rent control on all properties, right? That, what's been holding them back is Costa-Hawkins saying it can only be pre-96 properties. And I thought Berkeley and Santa Monica were in that, Santa Clarita, some of those places were in that situation already that, their original legislation said they want to rent control everywhere, but the Costa-Hawkins is what froze it. So I'm not exactly sure on that, but that could be a possibility. It could come very quickly, right? Where, pre-96 properties, probably in most places, even like Berkeley, make up less than half of the properties, right? So there's only you probably have better statistics on that. There's only half the properties are under rent control. Now the entire city becomes under rent control. And that's great for the people who are currently living there. That might have been in Berkeley for whatever reason. They have to move out, and then I don't think they're going to be able to come back to Berkeley. I think they'll be able to go to a community, a nearby one, right? But back to Berkeley, that landlord is going to, that's this gentrification. The rents can only rise by the amount. And then, there's all these rent control boards that you can appeal this and such, but that's where it just becomes so messy in regard to, working against the market. And all this stuff is done, and if we really want to help low income people, there's a bunch of ways to do it, direct income assistance and such. That's kind of the economist on this. And, the vast majority of economists, it's one of the things we teach in basic economics, about rent control and concerns about putting it in place.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe two more. So I'm thinking Mike, and then if everybody else has already gone. Right. So Mike is next. And then if everybody had one time, we'll come back to you and you'll have the final question. Okay?
Yeah, this is quick. In Berkeley.
And actually, I think is something that needs to be put in place, but rent control doesn't have to do with short-term rentals. There has been evidence that short-term rentals are decreasing the housing stock, the rental housing stock that's available for people who actually live in that city. Studies like in San Francisco. So cities are trying to regulate Airbnb, but it's very hard because it is new. So your question, so I think the rent control are, depending on how a city defines short-term rental, that could impact rent control. But I don't have a great answer to your question. I don't know if you have any other.
It also doesn't apply to if you're just renting out your granny flat or a room in your house, be it short-term or long-term. I mean, again, this could change. A local ordinance could put that in place, but most of the ones that exist now, those are exempt. But I mean, with the repeal of Costa-Hawkins, everything is kind of fair game. It's turned over to locals to decide what they want to do.
Michael, last question. So if you've got time in there, you can. So Michael, last question, final question. And both of you had gone once before, and Michael was already in the line. So
I'll tell you, mine is actually, Nicole read my mind and answered 90% of my question. So this could only take seconds from one or either of you. So has there been an occasion that either of you are aware of in California where a renegade rent control board sort of instigated a reign of terror over the city, and the city council was, decimated and what? I mean, that's part of a lot of what we've heard is that there's a real potential for a regime to come in and significantly degrade the quality of city government.
I honestly don't understand where that claim comes from. And as far as I know, what I've read would support that. I don't know what the basis of that claim is.
The rent control board will be elected in most cases, right? They are elected. So, we live in an ideologically divided society. So there will be, a candidate would probably be more pro-tenant and a candidate would probably be more pro-landlord, right? And they might go against each. Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. I mean, in Sacramento, it was proposed that the rent control board the elected would come out of the same as the city council district. So you can expect the city council person, carrying a lot of weight in regard to recommending their candidate who's going to be on the rent control board. And it probably would mimic the political differences, across the city. So yeah, I think it could be fair and balanced. It probably would be very reflective of what the city would want to do. So yeah, it's very hard to envision a rent control board. I imagine these would only have 2-year, maybe 4-year terms maximum. So the reign of terror could only be that long, unless the city people wanted it. They would reelect them and put them back in place.
Okay, so that is all the time we have for this independent expert panel. We'll have a second independent expert panel in a few minutes. First, we are going to take a break.
Thank you.
No, I have a professor that worked on this, but this isn't
Oh,
ours.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is, I think, the
This one
real
too.
estate school. I have worked this. I was working with the urban displacement project. So.
Those are two things that I cite more about the NIMBYs and things, and why things are slowing down in regard to housing production.
Yeah. I think this one.
No, it's a difficult problem. I can definitely see the reaction, populist reaction.
Yeah.
For rent control in place.
Yeah.
10 minutes. Back.
It's really just Silicon Valley. It's in Silicon Valley, the most valuable land country, and choose the property owners want to protect it. And Berkeley built next to a transit stop.
These are all. This is what I was working on. The citizen resistance. But there are constraints that are enforced by citizen resistance.
Ruin the view of the Bay Bridge. Yeah, or this is Berkeley and the Sierra Club, and these are all these very progressive people who strongly oppose the idea of building 5-story buildings at trains like the Nano for giving people out of automobiles, but
I mean,
and then anytime a housing development is proposed, through CEQA, it has to go through these environmental impact reports.
yes, we have to move. Oh, we're not supposed to
Talk to each other outside the session.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Nicole?
Hi, how are
Good to see
you?
you.
Hard not to follow. I read your paper last night. Like a not sticky at all. Around the block with
Yeah, I'm glad.
yeah.
Also has where did you get your job? Where did you get your job?
Couldn't find individually wrapped trail mix, so everyone's just getting little plates of it.
All right. Let's see. Testing. The plug is fine. It's just the location of the video camera. Yep, the plug is fine, so don't touch it. Just the location of the video camera. It still needs to be tilted down. A little down a little bit more. to the right. Sorry, the other way. There we go. Perfect. That's good. Great. Back at 3:30. 5 minutes. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay, Betsy, can you hear me? Okay, hold on a second. I can't hear you. That's a problem on my end. Here we go.
Get on the phone.
Okay, got it. I can hear you now. All right, that's fine.
How come? I guess because I have a
Just so you know, you're on the big screen right now, and everybody can hear you. So just so you know, that's always better, yeah. For me.
Actually, I can't see anything but you. Is there going to be a picture of the room or anything?
Unfortunately, not. Your picture is of the clock, and
okay.
Just the way I have it arranged here, I might be able to turn this computer around and maybe able to see your fellow panelists. Do that clock, and you'll have to depend on our voices.
Okay. Okay. A minute left. Are you available to do that, or it's up monitoring?
We could probably do something like that. Knock glass or something. Yeah, sure.
But I did have a question because I haven't.
I'm afraid none of us will be able to answer that question because we can't deal in the content of the process at all. So just address the ones that match your expertise,
Okay.
and if they've already been answered, then that's all right. Most of the time, you voted. And can you see the clock, Betsy?
Yes, I can. It says 6.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Okay. I'm going to try these different glasses. Yeah, I can't.
Hey, Betsy, can you hear me?
Yeah. Who is this?
Larry Rosenthal, your fellow panelist.
Yes, I realize Berkeley. I'm on Sacramento Street.
Okay, well, I was on Sacramento Street a few minutes ago and then I drove here.
Oh, kidding. You made it to Sacramento? Excellent.
Yeah, I left Hearst Avenue at 12:55.
You made good time.
Yeah, no, it was
Traffic must be light.
well, it was prevailing winds mostly.
Oh, okay. Did you balloon up or?
No, it's, I've carried a privilege to be before.
Okay. Yeah, I would have loved to have been able to do that. The drive was a little daunting.
Yeah, for me too. I just had to kind of feather it in.
It would have been worth it. Was excited to hear about this project. So you're in the public policy department, or?
That's School of Public Policy and Berkeley in policy.
Yeah.
So, it's Operation Berkeley Food and Housing Project.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
What, are they the ones that are going to move into the 9th Street shelter? Great. You know,
I don't mean to jump in here, but could we?
Voice is booming, ringing.
Yes, I know the voice is not
mine
is not ideal, but yours comes through clearly in the room. We'll turn down the mics a little bit.
Okay.
We're just about to get started here, so we could pause the conversation.
I'm going to get some water.
Okay.
I'd love some too.
So can I just ask, we have 6 minutes to start, and I'm happy to go second, so I can be inspired by you, or I could go first. But do we then answer other questions from the participant?
Hi, Betsy. My name's Robin. I'm one of the moderators. The process, if you just.
Okay, I might sometimes not be able to understand what you're saying, so if you'd like to text me at anything.
Okay. It's pretty straightforward. And could you just let me know that you can see the clock right now?
I can. It says 6 minutes.
Okay. So Michelle will be flagging when you have a minute left.
Oh, great.
In your time. Then I'll just do a ding. Hopefully not, but just to let you know the time's up.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We're getting settled back in the room. Hopefully you had a short, sweet break. And just for the panelists' awareness, if I could get everybody's attention to the front of the room at this point. Shh. Oh, that was nice. Who just did that? Thank you. That was really nice. Takes a bit. Second verse, same as the first. Process-wise, we'll be doing the same that you just did with the previous panel. So each of your panelist participants, or rather your independent expert panelists, will have 6 minutes each to go and basically respond to any of the list of questions that you crafted that they feel that they have the expertise to respond to. And that'll be 6 minutes each. And then we'll go into the queue where you're able to ask follow-up questions, questions from your list, or questions that you think that they could best respond to that will help you get well-informed so you can well-inform the voters on this proposition. So it's a little bit different because we have and I'll get out of the way so you can see Betsy. We have one of your independent experts is on the screen. She can't see you. She can't see any of us except for the clock. She can see the clock.
And I can see Lynn. I have a beautiful picture of Lynn.
And a picture of Lynn. Yeah, a picture of Lynn. So we'll do our best. We'll do our best to keep you both on track and supported. And I don't know if you did resolve who wants to go first, but maybe you could.
I heard that my colleague wanted to go second. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll go second, Betsy.
Not there. It helps me warm up to hear you.
All right. Does everybody sit in this panel? You all have your questions out in front of you, pens and paper, jot down notes for follow-up questions. Are you guys feeling like you're ready to go? All right, sweet. So let's start the clock, and you can introduce yourself, and you'll have 6 minutes.
6 minutes for what?
To do your introductions and respond to any of the questions on the list that you feel qualified to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'd be delighted to respond to such homework, so bear with me. My name is Larry Rosenthal, and I've been teaching public policy at UC Berkeley for more than 25 years. And I've been intensely focused on housing policy for about 20 of those years. And I have taught and thought about rent control for most of that time. And I remember well the Costa-Hawkins debate and others that have interceded over the remaining years. I teach rent control in the classroom. It's an exciting set of questions for what we call the efficiency equity trade-off policy. Language, this question is not about what to decide. It's about who gets to decide. I'll move on to the questions. Number one, considering that fair does not mean equal, and I'm not sure about that preface. Very often, the utmost fairness, of course, is equality. But moving on, what is a fair rate of return and how is this determined? I think it's a constitutional question. The question of rate of return is legal standard comes up in the clause, 14th Amendment. And I think that the law has not been wonderful at drawing clear lines. Experts tend to testify around what an average market rate of return is, or a representative rate of return, meaning that no player in a given market should get markedly less than some threshold. And it puts together concepts that are essentially quantitative with concepts that are essentially ethical. And in public policy and law, we don't do well on that interface. Happy to talk more about it. But as a starting point, the market average is an interesting point of departure. We know that a lot of folks earn more and less than an average. So what's fair? Number two, are all the fees passed on to the tenants, or is there an additional impact on all taxpayers? I can safely say that there's no additional impact on all taxpayers if you're in an environment which by design is attempting to entirely finance the operation of the Rent Stabilization Board by fees. Who knows how well they are doing or have done by that. And I know of no study or good budgetary that does really well or even takes a sample of cities. We are in small n numbers when it comes to the adoption and application of rent control period, and mature rent control even smaller numbers. So I'd love to learn more with you on that. The notion that the question presumes, which is, can prove to me that all fees aren't passed on to the tenants, we would need to talk about how Marco rents under rent control and not under rent control are set. There's no all or nothing. It's what we can find someone to pay for some unit at some point in time. Okay, good. Number three, with regards to claim number 13, which I'm not familiar with, but which I'll intuit the implication. What are the factors, causes, and effects of gentrification? Let's stop there. It does not define gentrification. Gentrification is a subjective term. The object of change, folks who hate neighborhood change or the distributional can use the vocabulary of gentrification. Those who are on the opposite side and feel that they're the winners, they don't call it gentrification, they call it revitalization. Same neighborhood change. So we would policy my definition is very narrow about carry movers who is suffering undue economic hardship. And finding out who that is, let's help them. That is my working definition of gentrification by my own estimate, non-scientific. About that, when it comes to the arrangements of groups in a geography, we have language of segregation. I don't know why we would use language of gentrification, unless we're talking about a process by which a more or less segregated outcome results. I don't mean to be too picayune about it. I think we need to be questions what the meaning of the words in the questions are. And I'm open for all sorts of conversation about that. Last question, because I'm down to 50 seconds. In what way does Prop 10 make rental costs go up? And how would it make it harder for people to find affordable housing? What data do I have available? I have steady access to what the regions buy me, and they're very kind and thoughtful, and they have a lot of foresight. So I would like census in various stripes, from the decennial censuses to the yearly ACE and the 5-year composites of the American Community Survey. And beyond that, the American Housing Survey, the AHS, which is a really nice way to study neighborhoods and housing units almost longitudinally, because they take a sample and look at that same sample every 2 years, but it's a national picture. The metropolitanly performed, and my time is out.
Thank you. All right, so Betsy, you've got 6 minutes, and Michelle will flash up the 1-minute warning, and then I'll cue you if you've gone to 6 minutes. And again, your task is to look through the questions and answer any of those that you feel qualified to answer. Thank you. And a little introduction to.
Okay, thank you. My name is Betsy Morris. I have a small planning consultancy, research consultancy called Planning for Sustainable Communities, with economic sustainability of people being able to live and thrive in local neighborhoods being very important part of my work, especially helping children in poverty, for example, with Head Start clients. And I also have a strong background with regional development, which just simply means to look at economics, health in a package in a way that's different from someone who specializes just in the housing market, operates, within. And I also want to say I'm so appreciative of and envious that you all get to be there in a citizen jury. I greatly support them and hope you find it worthwhile. And I'm looking forward to your results. So first, among question 1, for example, that under the HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, sets what it calls a fair market for Section 8 landlord, which is we subsidize the landlord so that a market rate, a fair market rate, and very low income people can live with people under the poverty guideline usually. So right now, the fair market rate of HUD is lower than what property owners can get just by kicking out their and moving on to the speculative housing market. So fair market, a fair market return is a good question, an important one, and it's a term of art, and really who's judging. But under that situation here in Berkeley, for example, our former housing director, who's got a doctorate in economic or city planning, I think, calculated 22 million extra dollars go in 1 month, that large property owners were making 22 million more dollars in that month from Berkeley renters, even with rent control, which is only a portion. So understand the scale. Prop 10 is a response to a much larger situation. And there are alternatives for which you also would look into if you were looking more broadly than Prop 10. But there is a question of not under number 3, which I think is a really important one. Another word for gentrification is displacement. And displacement in cities, displaced 2 at the bottom of the ladder is the question. So in the past, you might have more and more and more people bottling into a few rents because at one time, landlords were tied to local wages. And so there was always someone who rent, they have an undesirable property and they would rent it to someone who with very low income, and more people would then pack into that apartment. I saw that in San Jose when I worked there. And it's historically true. But today the displacement is different. And so people are being pushed, people who need resources, or they're able and willing, or young people of whatever race willing to share houses are now able to pay to live in a place with their people. Immigrants have often done this for years. So but right now we have people being pushed in because there are no cheap houses anywhere in the state, certainly not enough that are affordable to the large number bottom of the wage scale. So let me say placement means people are either trading off housing or transportation. Are they driving or are they without a job? And in fact, it's really important, I believe, to look at the effects of these, which do include a racial component, the racial division, as we know from history. I know how many millions of people will have improved quality of life. I do know that housing stability is a crucial factor that has been affecting, low-income children, and I believe at one point half of our children were in poverty in California, or the largest concentration 4 times in a year. 25% of all the families had to move, which means they're being disrupted. And so stability is an incredibly important aspect if the quality isn't what you want. A bigger issue, more and more money going into housing costs. And that's a real factor. And in fact, the majority of jobs in the Bay Area, for example, will eventually are low and moderate income jobs. And there's been research by the center. My time is up.
You heard that beep?
I'll be glad to give you the larger perspective.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So we'll go into Q&A now, and you'll each have an opportunity, 2-minute opportunity to respond to the question. If panelists, you have a question, you want to direct it to one or the other experts, you can do that, but they'll both have an opportunity to respond.
2 minutes question.
2 minutes per
not per
question.
speaker.
2 minutes. I've got Pat's going to flip her card up. I can see it. All right, we'll start with Pat. Can somebody hand
To those that went to Berkeley and had housing under rent control, and I got to go down and visit her. And the state of many of the places she lived was very, very poor. There was not sufficient incentive, but rents didn't go up. I don't know if they've solved that in recent years, but I was not happy as a mother going down seeing conditions where she was living. Another problem was that the attorney that she ended up working for had a property in rent control, not a beautiful place, on Shattuck Avenue. Once he kept it under rent control. It was close to his office. Now, he had a much nicer home up on the hill that he went to. And I've heard of other people stating that there are people that keep their rent control as a unit, even though they moved someplace else. I don't know if this is a big problem, but it sure doesn't seem fair to me. So if you could maybe address that, or control fees to the landlords if the tenant complains over something to get, and can that be an assessment against the property to get it fixed?
That's a lot of questions.
I know. Sorry.
Could we choose one topic and phrase a question, please?
Use your mic. Forming a question that they can respond to.
Anyone here is at any of that sounds interesting?
It all sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I can enumerate the topics. You've raised topics of housing quality. You've raised topics of housing price. You've raised topics of landlord behavior. You've raised topics of landlord incentives. I think that's only the 4 ones I remember.
Let's get it to one question, Pat.
No, she was a renter down there. There's the abuses under rent control. But let's talk about maybe the incentives for the property owner to keep up the place under rent control, because there's been some serious abuses in the past.
Thank you.
Let's try that.
Would you like to start that, my dear colleague?
Sure. So I wanted to, there was a study done in Berkeley examining post-Costa-Hawkins conditions, and it has been found that the conditions in some of the after vacancy decontrol have improved, and renters are more likely to say they're in good condition rather than fair condition. But I don't know how extensive that was a general finding, but that was, of course, keeping in mind that the students are pretty pretty much in a cap. So you can, the issue I would add is that with rent control, you have, and even with rent control, the prices are still outside what a student can afford in most cases. There is situation in Berkeley, I don't know how widespread, where seniors who started out as students, but now they're because they simply can't afford anything anywhere else, and they are already paying a disproportionate amount of their income, 30 to 50% or more of their income. So there's no guarantee that conditions will be better under rent control. I think the issue is about stability. They can sublet their apartment if that's been part of their lease, or if, and there are some situations where landlords have been rated, and that could be fine-tuned. I think the issue is whether that's something that needs to be in enabling legislation, or whether it's a by community, as if they should choose to implement.
Thank you. Larry?
Thank you very much. Thanks again for the great questions and the narrowing. Landlords are in a business, but not all landlords look at it in a kind of a detached, professional way. Some of them do it very interpersonally. I would say that the empathy factor is compassionate, very patient. If you're late on your rent, they'll give you time. If you have a problem in your unit, they'll work with you. And there are folks of higher and lower empathy as well. I think that when a family sends a child who's about to become an adult after some adolescence work off to college, we expect that person to be we put them in what the law calls in loco parentis, meaning that we expect that that person who's taking care of that unit will care about that person the way we care about them. And I think the market doesn't do a very good job of that in two respects. First, it doesn't price that service. It doesn't put it into the deal. And beyond that, the folks who most need patience, they don't necessarily find the landlords who have it in greatest supply. We can, talk in a broad brush way all we want about lower revenue, keep the unit up. And if we go over the long enough run and a big enough sample, we should not be surprised that rent control leads to some deterioration and possibly a lot easier to judge at the local level than in the state capital of a very big, diverse state.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mike's up, and then Rose S. And then Stanley.
Yeah, we've been hearing landscape apartments, and that's kind of what I was concerned with. Do you have any other data or any kind of thing to it that would give us more information on the limit of new construction in a rent-controlled city?
Sure. Can I start that one?
Sure.
Okay. State research development markets do their best to project what the rental revenue stream will look like. And in fact, in this environment, if you're thinking about a new multifamily project, one of the things you're going to think about is what's the relative likelihood 10 will pass or will fail. I'm going to try to price that into your. This is a business in which an investor has money to invest on a risk basis, and we rate the likelihood of a level of return, and we allow the capital markets to work in that way. The data and the studies are very clear that the more you dampen the returns to rental real estate, the less new rental real estate development there will be. Why would we ever consider it would be otherwise? That said, if we consider that to be some kind of social loss, some kind of great concern about a rental, some people can have less displacement. And that's a genuine question. That's a heart-wrenching question. If one side or the other of those constant and say, well, I'm comfortable with current equity and displacement conditions, let's just talk about supply. It's a much easier analysis. And in the places that will be the most aggressive rent control, that is a greater concern that they should have. However, were Prop 10 to pass, what we would try at the policy school is to unleash a new era of innovation where the downside would be dampened and the upside would be protected. Thank you.
All right, Betsy.
Okay. So it's not clear to me that there's a direct relationship between a rent-controlled city and the limits on construction, because there's been a great deal of new construction in Berkeley and San Francisco and Oakland, and I don't believe it's because of rent control or inhibited by rent control, because these buildings are exempt in the implementation here for many years. So, but more to the point is, are the older property owners, do we extend it beyond the older properties, or would you want to? And I believe the issue is here is that the wealth inequality in the United States and in Calif is it turns out mostly driven by the real estate industry, because of this is where some people control what the cost of housing will be and make money from it, and other people are on the receiving end and have no control. So I wanted to say was there are alternatives, the alternative housing developers who believe in an ethical or a low-cost nonprofit rate of return, which means they do make enough money to have enterprise. And so it's important to consider other forms of ownership. And when we look at the toolkit of how to bring housing, which is a human right, take it out of the ability of speculative windfall profits. And I've become more extreme about saying these words because there is a bigger implication. But many cities in California have not been building apartment buildings, and they have no rent control, and a prejudice of homeowners against renters, and the desire for developers to chase 20% of households, 20% of the households, and I think that's even shrunk in the last few years.
Thank you.
The clock froze at 2.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I had 2 seconds forever.
All right, Rose S. And we'll add Michelle to the queue.
Okay, how will the rent control affect housing, maybe construction also for the seniors, low-income families?
Can you repeat the question?
How will the rent control affect housing for low-income people that are, families that are on the HUD program, Section 8, and also for senior low-income housing?
Well, my direct answer is that folks in need, be they seniors or lower or moderate income families, working or not, homeless or not, are square wish to extend rent control regulation. If rent control is done well, then by its very definition, we want rents controlled for those who are having the hardest time affording the shelter part of their budget. So liquors, it sure depends upon what they do. If in fact a new era of rent control development, which I would probably call 3rd generation rent control regulation, was to be unleashed, one of the things that my students and I would put forward to help the folks who are having the hardest time affording shelter, who are having the hardest time keeping stability, who are having the hardest time needs. If we go through the process of lifting Costa-Hawkins and allowing locals to do what they wish, and there are some local governments who wish to do that, who wish to make that wealth transfer from landlord to, and don't do well, they'll be hearing from us.
All right, Betsy?
this is a really important question, and it doesn't come into play when we talk about market. Markets don't necessarily want to distinguish the greatest component of those in poverty. And there are very few Section 8 vouchers or place-based Section 8 subsidies available. So most of them are living in which could be unsafe. But I'll tell you, there's very little actual research that's going on here in Berkeley, where seniors are the largest, fastest growing demographic. I'm working with the rent board to create, well, they can't participate, but they're sponsoring to limited what's going on with seniors, because more of our people on the streets are